Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Wilkes. I'm a first-year fellow in child and adolescent psychiatry at Tripler Army Medical Center in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Hey, so I'm Aaron Wolfgang. I'm a fourth-year psychiatry resident also at Tripler Army Medical Center. And so Sean and I were both guest editors of the American Journal of Psychiatry Residence Journal, curating an issue dedicated to the topic of military psychiatry. And as a part of this whole process, we're also collaborating with the Residence Journal editorial board to bring you this podcast as a complement to this issue on military psychiatry. And before we go further, I also want to say that although both Sean and I are both in training, we're also both active duty military officers. And because of that, we also want to preface this podcast by saying that the views expressed in this podcast are entirely our own and don't reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government in any way.
Yeah, thanks a lot for mentioning that, Aaron. So the overall idea of this podcast episode is to talk a little bit about what psychiatry is like in the Army and to familiarize people with some of the unique aspects of the role and some of the fascinating issues that we can face.
What I would add is that we really hope to highlight that an Army psychiatrist is just like any other civilian psychiatrist, except for the fact that there's a few additional unique aspects of our job that we hope you listeners will find pretty fascinating to learn more about. And with that, Sean, what led you to want to be a military physician and ultimately a military psychiatrist?
You know, I get that question a lot because my path to becoming a psychiatrist was a bit circuitous. I started out in the Army as a science and engineering officer before medical school. I was on ROTC scholarship in college, and I majored in neuroscience and wanted to be able to do something with my degree after I graduated and commissioned as an Army officer. And I'll tell you, it was absolutely a fantastic experience. I got to do a lot of really cool things, from policy work at the Pentagon to doing clinical field research in the heart of the Congo jungle. And I got to travel all over the world, from Afghanistan to Zaire. But what I learned about myself in doing the clinical work in particular was just how much I enjoyed working with patients, learning about them, hearing their stories, solving problems with them. And that's what ultimately led me to attend medical school. And it was there that I found that psychiatry in particular was an absolutely perfect blending of that personal side of medicine and my long-standing interest in neuroscience.
What would you say are your future plans as an Army psychiatrist?
Well, I love teaching and research, so I'd like to continue working as an academician. And I'll tell you, the military is a great place to be an academic psychiatrist, too, with multiple residencies across the country where you can serve as faculty members, not to mention the Uniformed Services University, which is the military's very own medical school and health sciences campus right across the street from the NIH. So there are a lot of great options for researchers and educators alike, and I really like that about the Army. So what about you, Aaron? What led you to want to become a military physician and military psychiatrist?
So I actually grew up around the military my entire life. My dad was an Army intelligence officer who served in the first Gulf War. And even after he got out, he ended up still working in government, which fortunately for us meant that I got to grow up on Army base in Seoul, Korea until I graduated high school. And a lot of great memories there. And growing up around the military really emphasized the importance of service as a core value. And because of that, service has been a huge common thread throughout my life in a lot of different ways. So when I had the opportunity to go to the Uniformed Services University for medical school, the choice was pretty clear to continue that thread. I'm honestly a huge believer that purpose and meaning, at least in part, come from meaningfully contributing to a cause beyond yourself. For me, when I'm sitting across from a service member sharing their stories of tragedy and triumph, there's seriously nothing that fills me with more passion and a sense of purpose. Being able to help guide these service members through their healing on a daily basis is just so incredibly humbling and gratifying. And to get paid to do it is just a bonus. At the end of the day, those men and women who have already sacrificed so much and who are now asking for help, they are why I chose to be an Army psychiatrist.
And what do you want to do in the future, working as an Army psychiatrist?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to be picked up for an addictions fellowship at Yale starting this summer, which fortunately the Army has been super supportive of. After that, my ultimate hope is to continue serving as faculty, educating residents, and to work on some pretty exciting innovations for how we treat PTSD.
So you spent the most of the last 4 years working in one of the largest military hospitals in the country, covering basically services for half of the globe. It's a pretty exciting place to work. What is day-to-day life like for a psychiatrist in the Army?
Yeah, so and I would say before getting further into that, I do want to start off by clearing up an occasional misconception that the military health system and the VA health system are one and the same. Although these two excellent health systems are related, they're two very distinct entities run by separate government organizations. The VA, on one hand, cares for those who have finished their service obligation, whereas the military health system focuses entirely on active duty service members and their families. Those who've retired after 20 years of service are also eligible to receive care in the military health system as an added benefit if they choose to do so. With that said, we still see the entire spectrum of patients from those with depression, anxiety, trauma, addiction, eating disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, you name it. And in terms of demographics, it is somewhat skewed towards younger adult males. At the same time, we still see plenty of family members like spouses, older retirees, and even children.
So I know you're at Tripler now, but you might be doing this work in an outpatient clinic at Fort Bragg, working with paratroopers and special forces, or you could be assigned to a large academic medical center like this one, or in Texas, or pretty much anywhere around the globe, right?
Exactly. So, from an academic perspective, the Army has plenty of opportunities for faculty appointments at Uniformed Services University, at one of the two psychiatry residencies at either Walter Reed in Bethesda, Maryland, or at Tripler Army Medical Center here in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is where Sean and I are currently at. The Army also operates the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, which really is the pinnacle of research in military psychiatry with a particular focus in PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and suicide. And as a resident, there's an incredible amount of camaraderie, not only between all the residents, but also with the faculty as well. There's this added element that even after residency, we'll be constantly crossing paths and serving along the same mission for the rest of our military careers. And I think that in particular really brings us closer together and adds a layer of really wanting to build each other up. Our faculty, they also bring a range of experiences to the table. For example, our program director, Colonel Judy Koval, she's been deployed multiple times and, in fact, was an Army intelligence officer before going into medicine. She and the rest of our faculty prepare us incredibly well clinically, but there's also the added emphasis on the nuances of working with soldiers both on and off the battlefield. For example, when we see soldiers in the clinic or on the ward, we'll often also interact with their commanders to advise them on how they can best support the soldier, who also, of course, is our patient. Sometimes this means implementing a military medical order to mandate certain support for the soldier, such as, for example, ensuring that the soldier has 8 hours of protected time to sleep. Sometimes we'll recommend certain changes in the occupational environment, such as ensuring the soldier doesn't have access to weapons or doesn't do certain types of physical activities, perhaps. And on rare occasions, we'll recommend separation from the military. But at that point, typically isn't reached unless the soldier has undergone extensive treatment and still carries a poor prognosis. So I touched on several different aspects of what it's like to be an Army psychiatrist in a non-deployed setting, but that's only one side of the coin. Sean, would you mind telling us more about the Army psychiatrist in the deployed setting?
Yeah, sure. So one of the unique aspects of military psychiatry is our role not only as clinicians caring for individual patients, but also as advisors to military leaders and managers of behavioral health across the battlefield. And there's a long history of this, dating back to at least World War I, when Dr. Thomas Salmon, arguably the father of operational psychiatry, also a former president of the APA, innovated the approach of treating psychiatric battlefield casualties as close to the front lines as possible, with the ultimate goal of treating psychiatric casualties, then they were termed war neuroses, and returning service members back to duty whenever possible. And many of the same basic principles that Dr. Salmon introduced 100 years ago continue to guide us today, and operational psychiatrists work to ensure the provision of care with maximal proximity, immediacy, expectancy, and simplicity. That is, to treat close to the front lines quickly and simply with an expectation of return to duty.
So, do you mind going a little bit more into what exactly operational psychiatry is?
Broadly speaking, it refers to the provision of psychiatry within the context of a military operation. Perhaps a quintessential example of this role for an Army psychiatrist is the division psychiatrist. So a division in the Army is a largely self-sufficient organization of between 10,000 and 20,000 soldiers, comprised of still smaller organizations known as brigade combat teams. And each of those are assigned its own individual behavioral health officer, typically a psychologist or licensed clinical social worker. And then the division psychiatrist serves to oversee behavioral health within the entire division, and as the division subject matter expert on the behavioral health effects of combat. So prior to deployment, the division psychiatrist is responsible for developing and implementing training programs for behavioral health officers in the subordinate commands, for primary care providers, for non-medical officers and non-commissioned officers. And then during deployment, it's the responsibility of the division psychiatrist to review intelligence and assess the behavioral health threats of the combat environment, and to work closely with the rest of the division's medical team to review how behavioral health assets are being deployed and utilized within the operational environment. So he or she makes recommendations to the division's commanding general on where to position and how to implement behavioral health resources within the unit. And the division psychiatrist is also responsible for monitoring and providing guidance on the use of psychotropic medications within the combat theater to ensure that the psychiatric needs of soldiers in theater are being met, and helping to determine whether any patients require psychiatric hospitalization.
So you've actually painted a really great picture of how Army psychiatrists provide leadership in the deployed environment. Do you mind speaking more about what it's actually like to deliver direct clinical care in the deployed environment?
Yeah, well, any psychiatrist in theater is likely going to be involved in seeing patients too. But another role that an Army psychiatrist might serve within the deployed setting is as a member of a combat and operational stress control team. So these are flexible mobile teams of psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, behavioral health technicians. And they're designed to be positioned close to the front lines to provide prevention and treatment as close to the soldier and the soldier's unit as possible. So they're designed to take the treatment to the soldier in need rather than necessitating his or her transportation far from the line of battle. And a lot of their work is in the realm of prevention to provide soldiers with support as they experience the stressors of combat, but also to provide treatment of psychiatric casualties by offering resources and opportunities for recovery at specified locations in the deployed environment rather than requiring their evacuation. And they're also able to provide commanders with boots on the ground assessments of the state of mental health within the force.
So you just described Army psychiatrists interacting with commanders to discuss the mental health of their soldiers. Considering you've actually written about the ethics of military psychiatry, would you mind speaking more about the ethics surrounding this dynamic?
Yeah, well, so military psychiatrists have to follow the same ethical principles as any other physician, and that includes respecting patients' privacy and autonomy. But there are some unique needs of the military and risks within the combat environment that require some information to be shared with commanders in order to ensure that the military mission can be carried out. And so there are two ways we approach this. The first is to provide information to commanders in aggregate. A lot of the decision-making at the command level is more dependent on looking at trends rather than the details of any specific patient. And then the second is when it is necessary to discuss an individual patient with a commander, it's the psychiatrist's ethical duty to ensure that only the absolute minimum information is provided, and only to the specific leaders who need to know. And we take this role protecting patient privacy and autonomy very seriously. For example, if one needs to tell a commander that a given patient can't be deployed, one might share the general diagnosis or the class of medications that makes the patient non-deployable, but one wouldn't share any details discussed in therapy or the patient's full psychiatric history. So it's a careful and precise balancing act between individual patient needs and rights and the needs of the Army. And it's just one reason we place such a significant emphasis on medical ethics in our residency program.
Thanks for clarifying that, because that's super interesting, just those ethics behind all of that. And in fact, that's just one of the many topics that's going to be covered in this special issue of the Residence Journal, isn't that right?
Yeah, I'm really excited about what we've got in store for readers, because there's going to be some really interesting pieces on the subject of military psychiatry that I think our listeners will really enjoy. So stay tuned for that.
Sadly, we're about out of time at this point. Even though we've covered a lot of ground and touched on quite a few topics, there's still so much more to share about psychiatry in the military. Fortunately, we have plenty more headed your way. The articles in the upcoming special issue of the American Journal of Psychiatry Residence Journal highlighting military psychiatry is going to expand on a number of these truly fascinating topics, and we really hope you enjoy. Thank you. Thanks for listening.